In this video, we'll learn about the types of data associations in context. Before we begin, make sure you have this page either printed or pulled up digitally on your screen. Let's review the types of association. First would be a positive association. This means that the variables move together. Or, as one variable increases, the other increases. We could also say the opposite. As one variable decreases, the other also decreases. That's what we mean by they move together. Next would be a negative association. This means that the variables move in opposite directions. So as one increases, the other decreases. Or vice versa. As one decreases, the other increases. They move oppositely. Finally, no association. That means that a change in one variable has no effect on the other. In other words, they're not related. What we're going to attempt to do today is look at some of these datas in context, so real life examples of where we would see these, and try to determine if they would be positive, negative, or have no association. Before we continue with our notes, let's take a pause to figure out what our goal is for the day. We want to try to determine the type of association based on a context that has two variables. What you're really going to want to focus on is if the variables move together, if they move in opposite directions, or if they don't affect each other at all. Remember, if they move together, we say that means they have a positive association. If they move in opposite directions, they have a negative association. And if they really don't affect each other, there's no association. So let's look at specific examples. The first says the hours a person studies and their grade on the exam. Well, we would like to think that the more time you spend studying, the higher your score is going to be. That also works, most often, in the opposite direction. The less you study, the lower your score is going to be. Since those work together, we say that this has a positive association. Let's look at the next one. The hours a person studies and the hours they spend watching TV. So here we're talking about the amount you could study and the amount you could watch TV. Well, let's say that you study for a lot of hours. That means there's less hours to watch TV. Or vice versa. If you don't study that much, that means you have more hours to watch TV. So here they're going in opposite directions. More for one means less for the other. That means that this example would have a negative association. And finally, in the last example, the hours a person studies and the number of states they visited. Well, those two things aren't really related. I guess you could argue that if they're studying, they can't go to other states, but maybe they're studying in the car. Since those aren't related, at least not closely, we say that there's no association involved. Let's go back to our notes to keep practicing this. So in this table, we have the first variable, the second variable, and then our task is to determine what type of association they would have. So the first one says a person's height and a person's shoe size. What's tough about this unit is we're really good at thinking of the what ifs, but you have to think in terms of the general population for these and try not to think about the very weird, very specific examples that you can. So generally speaking, the taller a person is, the larger shoe size they have because the bigger their feet are. Or the shorter a person is, the smaller their shoes are. So since these are working together, we say this has a positive association. And again, we could say that's because they move together. Next up, we have the number of letters in a person's name and a person's IQ. Well, I'm sure you could maybe find some weird internet study somewhere, but those two things aren't related. The more letters you have in your name, doesn't necessarily mean that you either have a higher or lower IQ. So this would have no association, and it's because they're not related. They don't affect each other. Next up, the number of absences a student has and a student's GPA. Again, think generally. We would like to think that the more school you miss, the more assignments you miss, the more instruction you're missing. So odds are your GPA is going to drop. Or if you're there every day, you're doing the work, you're learning everything that you're supposed to, maybe the higher your GPA is going to get. So in general, because they're going in opposite directions, this would have a negative association, and that's because they're opposite directions. Again, think generals, not weird specifics. Okay, so next up, the last thing we're going to do is match context to graphs. So let's just read through the context and then look at the graphs. Part A says the temperature outside and the total gallons of gas sold. Part B says the size of the home and the cost of the utilities for the home. Utilities is things like electric and water, those types of things. And finally, the altitude of a hiker and the oxygen level in the air. So a good strategy is to kind of go for the one that you know for sure first. So like for me, I just bought a house, so I'm living in context B right now. The size of the home and the cost of the utilities. Well, the bigger the home, the more utilities you're going to be using. You have more lights, you have more showers, more toilets to flush that make your water go up. So this would have a positive association. So then I'm looking for which graph also has a positive association, which one's trending upwards. And that would be this graph here in the middle. It's trending up, just like the bigger house you have, the more utilities you're going to buy. Let's look at option C next. The altitude of a hiker and the oxygen level in the air. The higher up you go, like if you're climbing Mount Everest, the lower the oxygen level is in the air. So the higher you go up, the lower the oxygen is. Since those are moving oppositely, those would have a negative association. So I'm looking for the graph that's trending downwards, and that would be here. So this would go with context C. Now that process of elimination leaves me with this one of A. So let's make sure that's right. I see from the graph here that there's no association. It's not trending upwards, it's not trending downwards. And I can see that in context A, those two things aren't really needed or related. The temperature outside doesn't really affect the total gallons of gas sold that day. People still need to buy gas in the wintertime. So in summary, you're really going to want to focus on, do the variables move together? Do they move in opposite directions? Or do they not affect each other? Remember, when the variables move together, that means there is a positive association. If one going up makes the other go up, positive. If one going down makes the other go down, still positive because they're moving together. Now, if they're moving in opposite directions, meaning as one increases, the other decreases, that would be a negative association. And finally, if they're not affecting each other whatsoever, that would be no association. Remember, you're going to want to think in general terms. Don't try to think of weird specifics that would break a rule, but just in general, would these move together? Would they move in opposite directions, or would they not be related?